Here are the Beach Boys.
They first hit the airwaves back in 1961, and they were also one of the only American rock groups to survive the British invasion of the mid-1960s.
I guess it was John Lennon who calls you up and says, "That's the best thing I've ever heard."
Their early hits were almost instantly nostalgic as they sang about an idyllic adolescence in California full of surfing, cars, and girls. But life for the Beach Boys was far from perfect. This is a history deep dive, and today we're taking a look at the surprisingly dark and troubled history of the Beach Boys.
My cousin came over to my house one day just to fool around, and he said someday we should start a rock and roll group.
Now, the Beach Boys started off the way many rock bands do, in a garage in the suburbs. The band was comprised of the Wilson brothers, Brian, Carl, and Dennis, their cousin Mike Love, and a neighborhood friend, Al Jardine. Ironically, there was only one surfer in the group, Dennis, and it was his suggestion that they sing about the emerging sport that put them on the path to early success. They scored a regional hit on the radio waves with Surfin' in 1961.
You're a surfer.
Yes, ma'am.
Well, this is something we don't have much of in Oklahoma.
Yeah, I know.
In the early days, the band was managed by the Wilson patriarch Murray, who was a mildly successful songwriter in his own right. But while it's certainly not uncommon for a parent to manage their children's careers in the music industry, it rarely ends well. And Murray's relationship with the Beach Boys was a very mixed bag. On the one hand, Murray was instrumental in his son's musical development. He was the one who first taught Brian to harmonize, something the future songwriter and producer would become legendary for. He was also the one with contacts in the music industry, and after the success of Surfin', it was Murray that convinced the execs at Capitol Records to sign the boys as their first ever rock and roll band. On the other hand, Murray was physically, verbally, and emotionally abusive to the boys. In his memoir, Brian wrote that his father was violent and cruel, and that when he would drink, he would turn into a monster. When he didn't put his hands on us, Wilson wrote, he tried to scare us in other ways. He would take out his glass eye and make us look into the space where the eye used to be.
Did you live in fear of your father?
Yeah. Ask any artist in the world, and he'll tell you have to go through a little frustration, you know what I mean, before that creativity starts to flow.
And this disturbing behavior wasn't limited to just the Wilson home life. Murray was a notorious control freak in the studio as well. He would often tear into the bandmates for perceived mistakes or when they disagreed with his suggestions on a given song. He would threaten to end the recording session and would storm out of the studio in a rage. During recording sessions for Fun, Murray persistently critiqued Brian Wilson's production choices while also resorting to put-downs, name-calling, and proclaiming himself to be the only talented member of the Wilson family. After Brian told Murray he was wrong about a bass line sound, Murray erupted, and Brian responded by throwing him out of the studio and forcing an end to his day-to-day association with the band. Although he was no longer the band's manager, Murray retained control of much of the band's library of music, and in 1969 he sold the publishing rights to dozens of their hits, from Surfin' Safari to Good Vibrations to A&M Records for $700,000. Brian said of his father's decision, he believed we were washed up. He had taken the only thing that we knew would last, our songs, and sold it off like he was running a garage sale.
In some ways, I love my dad, because he scared me, and he scared me so much, I think he actually scared me into making good records.
The Beach Boys continued to turn out hits following Murray's departure. They had 7 songs in the Billboard Top 100 in 1964 alone. But 1964 marked a turning point for the band. In December of that year, Brian Wilson suffered a nervous breakdown on a flight from LA to Houston. Overwhelmed and unable to cope with the stress, Brian told his bandmates that he felt he had no choice but to stop touring. Now, he wasn't quitting the band, but he did feel that his time was best spent in the studio. And in many ways, this wasn't surprising. Brian had been the de facto leader of the group, at least on the production end of things, for quite a while. This allowed Brian to enter into what many consider his golden age of writing and producing. Brian produced the Beach Boys' most critically acclaimed album with Pet Sounds. The album was in many ways a response to the Beatles-led British invasion that swept through the music industry in the mid-1960s.
Pet Sounds was based on one of the Beatles' albums.
Rubber Souls,
yeah.
And when I heard that, I was so blown away. I said, God, I'm going to make an album just like that.
And although it was not initially a commercial success, the album would go on to be ranked as one of the greatest rock albums of all time by no less than the likes of Rolling Stone magazine. But on top of his struggles with mental health, Brian had begun experimenting with drugs, most significantly with LSD. And beginning in 1965, Brian began to hear voices in his head, a condition that he would struggle with for a very long time. This made him more and more difficult, both in his everyday life and in the studio. In one Pet Sound session, he even refused to speak to the visiting label executives, choosing only to answer yes or no questions via pre-recorded responses on the studio's audio deck. Then, after struggling and ultimately failing to produce the much-anticipated follow-up to Pet Sounds, an album that was to be called Smile, Brian fell off an emotional cliff.
My brain got burned out, and I had nothing left in my brain, you know. And every day of my life, I pay a little dues because of the drugs I took.
Now, Brian wasn't the only one of the Beach Boys to experiment with drugs or to make questionable life choices. In 1968, Dennis picked up 2 female hitchhikers on the Sunset Strip and invited them home with him. During the course of the evening, the trio discussed spiritualism, and the girls told Dennis about their guru, a man with an interest in the music industry. His name? Charles Manson. After a brief time away, Dennis returned home to find a bus parked out at the curb. Manson and about 20 of his girls had moved in, and they would stay for the better part of a year. At first, Dennis didn't seem to mind this arrangement too much, especially as Manson was more than willing to share his drugs and the attention of his girls. Wilson took to calling Manson the Wizard and implored the other Beach Boys to join Manson's tight-knit family of enlightened followers. Over the next several months, Dennis would spend close to $100,000 on the Manson family food, treatment for STIs, and property damage. He would also introduce Manson to many of his friends and music industry contacts, including Neil Young and Columbia Records executive Terry Melcher. Dennis even set up a recording session for Manson through the Beach Boys label. But after Manson pulled a knife on one of the studio engineers, Dennis decided that he'd had enough. Not one for confrontation, Dennis simply let the lease expire on his rented house and left the landlord to evict the Manson family. Dennis did, however, convince the Beach Boys to record one of Manson's songs, called Cease to Exist. They retitled it Never Learn Not to Love, and the band used it as a B-side of the single Bluebirds Over the Mountain. When Manson discovered that Dennis had changed the title and some of the lyrics of the song and had also credited himself as the only songwriter, he began to send threatening notes to Dennis, and this was ultimately the end of the relationship. Later that same year, the hoped-for record contract from Terry Melcher fell through, and Manson decided to launch his long-planned race war, Helter Skelter. On August 8th, Manson sent his family to 10050 Celio Drive with orders to kill everyone inside. This address was for the house Terry Melcher had moved out of only a short time before, and instead of the despised record producer, the Manson family found a pregnant Sharon Tate and 4 of her friends having a party. They killed all 5 of them in one of the most shocking crimes of the decade. Dennis found out that Manson and his family were responsible for this horrific act a few months later, and though he refused to talk about it, Mike Love believes his fellow bandmate carried the guilt of his association with Manson for the rest of his life.
Never Learn Not to Love. And
oh, I love that song. My brother Dennis
much.
did that, yeah.
Yes, I love that song.
Now, by 1975, Brian Wilson's mental health had collapsed to the point that he would lock himself in a room and refuse to speak to anyone for days on end. In desperation, his wife at the time hired celebrity psychologist Eugene Landy to give Brian one of his signature 24-hour therapy sessions. And within a year, Landy had assisted Brian to the point where he was able to leave home and actually record music. However, after a disagreement over fees, Landy, whose rate could be as much as $50,000 a month, was fired. But a few years later, after his divorce, Brian suffered yet more setbacks. His weight increased to 300 pounds and he started using drugs again. He was tens of thousands of dollars in debt and had been fired by the Beach Boys. So in 1982, Beach Boys manager Tom Hewlett decided to bring Landy back. Brian was told that if he agreed to treatment, he'd be reinstated and have access to his share of the group's income for that year. So Landy moved in with Brian and essentially held complete power over every aspect of his patient's life. He reportedly controlled Brian through fear tactics, telling him that unless he did everything he was told, Brian would have to be admitted to a psychiatric hospital. And he not only managed to get himself appointed as Brian's recording manager, but he also cut himself into Brian's future earnings as a co-songwriter and partner in a production company. Brian even referred to the therapist as a god. And it was only in 1988 that Landy finally began to lose control over Brian. Brian had met a woman named Melinda Ledbetter during an unaccompanied trip to an LA car showroom. They began a romantic relationship, and after finding a will that would give much of Brian's earnings to Landy in the event of his death, Ledbetter began to work with the Wilson family to extract Brian from Landy's control. Brian's family filed a 7-count complaint with the California Board of Medical Quality Assurance, which forced Landy to surrender his medical license in 1989. But Landy continued to live with Brian, and finally, a settlement of a 1992 lawsuit legally required Landy to drop all contact with Brian.
I wasn't allowed to call my family or my friends at all for 9 years.
He had that much control?
Yeah, he had that much control on my life.
Now, while Brian's life stabilized after his marriage to Melinda, his brother Dennis never seemed to find solid ground. He was married 5 times, including twice to model Karen Lamb. and to say his relationships were tumultuous would be an understatement. One fight with Lamb ended with her firing a revolver into their Mercedes, barely missing the fuel tank, and another ended with Dennis driving Lamb's Lamborghini down to Venice Beach and setting the interior on fire with lighter fluid. Likewise, his relationship with Fleetwood Mac's Christine McVie was characterized by days-long disappearances and acts of cocaine-induced property destruction. And unfortunately, it wasn't just his relationship with women that were filled with drama. It was also his relationship with the rest of the Beach Boys. Now, Dennis hadn't played the drums on many of the band's recordings after 1963, but he had continued to tour with them. His substance abuse issues, however, caused him to behave erratically, and in 1979, after missing several concerts or showing up too intoxicated to perform, he was fired. Dennis did manage to quit using cocaine in 1981 and was reinstated in the band, but withdrawal symptoms caused him to drink heavily, and the Beach Boys were forced to hire security guards to prevent him from drinking before shows. Wilson was once again kicked off the tour and told he could only return after he had completed a rehab program, and he did try. In late 1983, he checked himself into 2 different facilities, one in Arizona and one in California, but he only lasted 2 days at each before checking himself out. Now, shortly after Christmas that year, he got together with a group on a friend's boat in Marina del Rey, and according to Rolling Stone, Dennis had wanted to party one last time before he checked himself back into rehab. So the friends drank through much of the night and much of the next day, Dennis more than the rest. On his final night alive, Dennis grew nostalgic and decided that he wanted to recover artifacts from his marriage to Karen Lamb that he'd thrown overboard 3 years earlier. He was convinced that they would still be there under the boat. Dennis made several excursions into the water over the next several hours before diving one last time and failing to emerge. His body was recovered by the Harbor Patrol a short time later. Dennis was 39. The Beach Boys would be back on stage less than a month after Dennis's death.
Hi, my name is Dennis Wilson. I make rock and roll records.
And the hits would keep coming for the Beach Boys, both literally with songs like Get You Back and Kokomo, and figuratively, with infighting and lawsuits pitting the bandmates against one another. The band would be inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1988, but even that moment was not without its turmoil, as Mike Love's speech tore into the likes of Paul McCartney, Mick Jagger, Billy Joel, and even Bruce Springsteen. Carl Wilson would pass away in 1998 after a battle with lung cancer. He would continue playing with the band up until a few months before his death, scheduling chemo treatments between the tour dates. And a lawsuit was finally settled in 2008 that awarded the use of the Beach Boys name exclusively to Mike Love, after Al Jardine had toured with a separate band using a similar moniker. Brian Wilson would eventually release Smile in September of 2004. It was met with near universal acclaim. But in January of 2024, Brian lost his wife Melinda. A few months later, the Wilson family was awarded a conservatorship over Brian Wilson after demonstrating that he was suffering from a major neurocognitive disorder like dementia. Mike Love continues to tour with his band as the Beach Boys, often with Brian's replacement from the 60s, Bruce Johnson, playing alongside him. And Al Jardine continues to tour as well, with a separate group playing his own music. It's a sad and slightly muted ending for what was one of the most influential bands of all time. Given the rocky road that they've had over the decades, hopefully the remaining Beach Boys can continue the rest of their journey feeling only good vibrations.